The Neoliberal Podcast is part of the Neoliberal Project and made possible by our members and supporters. If you enjoy the podcast and want to become a member of the project, head to neoliberalproject.org/join. You can also support us on Patreon at patreon.com/neoliberalproject. These members and patrons help cover the podcast's expenses and make it all happen. Thanks for your support and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Progressive Policy Institute. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and this week's episode is our second episode in a series on effective altruism. What is effective altruism? It's a movement that says you should try to do good in the world, and you should also think very hard and very seriously about the best way to accomplish the most good that you can. So we're exploring some of the ways that people are trying to do good in the world using this frame of reference. This week's guest is Christine Parthemore. Christine is the CEO of the Council on Strategic Risks, an organization that is dedicated to fighting what they view as extremely large risks to kind of the world order. And that's what we're talking about today, specifically risks from weapons such as biological weapons and nuclear weapons. So Christine, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, I think the first thing we should do is just give the people a basic rundown of who CSR is. What does the Council on Strategic Risks do? What's the kind of thing you guys are trying to guard against? What are the strategic risks that you're worried about?
Thank you for that question. So the Council on Strategic Risks, our mission is to analyze, anticipate, and address systemic and catastrophic risks to security. And we also work to understand how these risks are working together to shape the world around us and then what to do about it. So in terms of catastrophic risks, these include any number of issues that could devastate or kill or destroy or displace vast numbers of people, such as the use of nuclear weapons or biological weapons. Our work also looks at the effects of extreme climate and ecological disruptions around the world. More so, we look at these things in a systemic manner. So in other words, how do all of these issues and stressors that are happening in the world today, how do they work together and how disruptive is that? So when a lot of bad things and bad stressors occur at the same time and in the same locations, to the same communities, et cetera, it can start to break down the resilience of our political, economic, social, and other systems. So you get to the point of what you call systems failing and systemic failure to things. And that can create some dramatic changes in the world. Some of those can be positive, but many can also be hugely destructive or disruptive and negative in the world. In the big picture, though, it's underexamined. All of these issues are individually relatively underexamined. It's not, most people don't go around their days thinking about all of these extreme risks to the world. But in particular, how do all of these things come together and how do they build up into shaping how the world is trending, how countries relate to each other, whether they're willing to engage in conflict, whether there are massive displacements of humans, mass devastation and death that occurs in different locations, and all of these bad things. And big picture, just like the effective altruism movement, I think generally our focus is as much as possible what to do about this and how to create solutions to these issues.
In effective altruism right now, there's kind of I don't want to say a battle, but we'll say some competing ideas. And those camps have sometimes been called short-termism versus long-termism, with the idea that long-termists are mostly concerned about like the long-term future of humanity and kind of these existential risks. And it seems like there are ways in which you would fall into that camp. Whereas short-termists are more focused about like, I want to help people right now. I want to make the world better right now. And there's ways that I think I can do that. So do you see yourself as falling more squarely into one of those camps? I'd imagine there's ways in which you align with the long-termist philosophy, but do you view your work in that way?
It's a great question. This is a really healthy debate and dialogue that I'm really grateful that so many smart people are are engaged in around the world. It's so important when you see all the issues that the world is facing right now. With the things that we work on in particular, I actually see them as both and coming together. And I think it's actually important to telling the story and making progress to connect those dots sometimes. So one example is on nuclear weapons issues. So the ultimate long-term goal would be to ensure that nuclear weapons cannot destroy humanity, which is a fantastic long-termist goal. And it's one that we care a lot about. Our theory, though, in how you get there is that you got to make sure that nuclear war does not break out in the meantime. So if nuclear weapons are used in the coming years, we're extremely concerned that could lead to a massive global disruption and escalation and conflict and things like that could be an even nearer term sort of devastation to the long-term survival of humanity. So we're working on practical steps that we think are going to be the most important to making sure that nuclear weapons do not get used in the near term, as we think about how to create that longer term arc of countries potentially giving up these weapons and not being attracted to having them or using them anymore. So similarly on the bio side, so we are very focused on sort of the catastrophic level of biological risks, the worst pandemics that could occur, the worst scenarios regarding a country potentially weaponizing diseases and using it in a large scale fashion against others. From my time at the Pentagon, it became very clear then that even though you're working on these scenarios that some people think might be a low probability of occurring, I don't actually think they're that necessarily low of a probability, but any probability puts the long-term survival of humanity at risk for some of these, pathogen weapons and some of these extreme pandemic scenarios. But if you work on that extreme case and you work on it aggressively, you end up implementing policies that foster technology development and deployment and data sharing and really rapid, more aggressive advances in measures to protect people's health, such as in personal protective equipment, really advancing to a much better scenario than what we have on hand today, or disease early warning systems that are a revolution compared to what we have today. But a lot of the technologies and tools are really starting to manifest around the world if we can just weave them together and cooperate internationally. So there's a lot of near-term things that we could do that will benefit public health, that will benefit people in the near term, in addition to sort of safeguarding the sort of longer-term arc of history and the future that we're trying to protect. And so I think it's important to, even if you are a long-termist, which is at the heart of a whole lot of what we do, I think it's important to come back to what are the practical things that we actually need to do today? And then also, how do those help people today as well?
So I want to come back to something that you said there, because the two main focuses I think that we're going to talk about today are risk from nuclear weapons and then biological risks. But you mentioned the fact that you don't actually think some of these attacks are as low probability as people might think. And there's always this question in effective altruism, why is this something I should work on as opposed to something else? People have different competing theories about like what is the best thing you could donate your money to or devote your time to. And you have obviously take this very seriously. You must have some very serious reasons for working on the work that you do. And so I'm going to ask a very simple question that's going to lead into some more complicated questions. But I guess to start with just nuclear, what do you think the chance is in the next, say, 30 to 50 years of a nuclear war breaking out?
So I don't get into numbers. I know there's a lot of, there have been efforts to actually do some probabilistic thinking about this type of thing. And all of that work is very important. I would actually, the way I like to phrase it is, I will be happily surprised if it does not. So again, in terms of the probability, is that a 50-50? What are the percentage likelihoods? I don't really try to think in those terms at all, but I think the way trends are looking today, including things like the types of nuclear weapons that countries are becoming more and more attracted to, if we can't bend away from that arc that has started to develop over the last decade, Another issue set is just ambiguity with certain types of weapons and how that can lead to miscalculations and misinterpretations between different parties. If you think about how, for example, the United States and Russia on different sides of the conflict in Ukraine right now, we're not really communicating very thoroughly, I assume, with the Russians. Miscalculations come up. People misinterpret the sides, opposite sides in a conflict on a regular basis. That's just the normal history of conflict. These weapons exist. There's a trend toward weapons that create more ambiguity in warfare scenarios, which is very dangerous. There are trends toward, people thinking that lower yield nuclear weapons are actually more usable. There are people who have been just talking openly in the past decade that you've heard about that, they think that if a country were to use a nuclear weapon in conflict, that you could reasonably assume that the other side is not going to retaliate with nuclear weapons if they have them. I think that's preposterous, and more so betting humanity on assuming that everyone's going to keep their cool if a bunch of your population or your land has been targeted with a nuclear weapon. I think that's really rolling the dice with humanity in an incredibly irresponsible way. And all of these trends in the nuclear field, they just add up to, I think the dangers of risk of use are just rising more and more over the last decade, or potentially even more than a decade. And again, so that's where we focus our attention. We have our theories with what's driving those risks higher and higher. And so our work is focused on how do you get countries to move away from those types of systems that are more likely than others to introduce a miscalculation risk between parties? How do you change, our current policies include things like, using nuclear weapons as a hedge against biological and chemical attacks conducted at a strategic scale. The Biden administration has been pushing the policy in a more constrained and restrained manner on that regard. So things like that are, again, practical things that we can do now that can help reduce the risk that either a future US leader will end up using nuclear weapons, but more so too, that another country will misread our actions and believe that the United States or another nuclear armed country like the United Kingdom, hopefully we can do things like that with our own policies that reduce the risk that other countries will misinterpret what we might be doing and sort of stumble into a nuclear conflict just based on a sort of elevated threat assessments of what the other side might be doing in a really tense conflict.
I think a lot of people would be really shocked to hear you say what you've said there, that, you think essentially it's more likely than not. If you'd be surprised if we avoid it, that's essentially giving an over 50% chance. And I think that would stun a lot of people to hear, say, isn't that way too extreme? Can you talk about some of the specifics why you think that is so likely, and like what's driving you towards that view, and maybe even I think it would be useful to like model out like what's a typical case if you worry about this happening and you think it's actually pretty likely in a lot of the futures that we could be facing. What's a typical example of a world where this ends up happening? What's the storyline, and then boom, the nukes go off?
Sure. And again, some of these are not even my propositions. Some of these are examples that have been gamed out by other scholars and experts and former defense officials that I find extremely worrying because I worry that they will lead in exactly that direction. And again, I think the only reason that it would be surprising is if people have not been paying attention to some of these narrative shifts they're really like massive narrative and policy shifts compared to where the United States was in the Reagan-Gorbachev era, for example, and some of the restraint held by George H.W. Bush that he introduced into U.S. policymaking and things like that. But these shifts have been very real, and they've been happening. So I'll give two examples of scenarios that concern me pretty significantly. So one is the U.S. government in its public assessments, as it has stated, is concerned that North Korea possesses biological weapons. There is a growing emphasis over the past, many years. It's not totally new, but in terms of scenario planning for what the United States and South Korea would do together to help deter, hopefully on the front end, any invasion or military action by North Korea, but how they would respond if such a conflict were to ensue. The scenarios are moving more and more toward more preemptive early actions. So quashing any invasion of South Korea, for example, quickly before North Korea has a chance to do really, really, really significant damage. And so the scenarios that again, not me, but others have introduced into this dialogue are, well, what if a biological or chemical attack were deployed on Seoul? We're very worried about biological weapons attacks in scenarios like this, because it could just look like, depending on what disease they chose, it could basically look like a natural outbreak that's used to weaken South Korea and get them very focused on a health response and things like that sort of shade over indicators that a more overt attack might be happening. What if our policies lean in the direction of, for example, a small scale nuclear attack on North Korea, if they believe that a WMD attack on South Korea is imminent, which is a scenario that, again, others have proposed as a reasonable part of our policy. And if we have those low yield nuclear weapons, that we have a political leader in place who's willing to say, yes, we have to do that. That's the only way to save South Korea. There are people who talk about, and I've had conversations with experts in Seoul about that exact type of scenario. And one of them looked at me when I was laying it out and just said, in the scenario that you described, Seoul is already gone. So in other words, just the danger of even thinking in those terms, but again, it's happening. There are people who actually believe that we should have at least planning, or if not just signaling for deterrence, that should be part of our option set, is that sort of flow of activities. And again, hopefully that will never occur. Hopefully such a conflict will be completely avoided. But there are a lot of people who weigh in on the trajectories of the courses of actions of all of these countries. And it's very complicated. And, we can't just assume that scenarios like that are never going to happen. Or that we, again, how do we put policies in place on our own side so that we are more restrained in making sure that doesn't happen in the future, except for an extraordinary scenario, way beyond anything else could handle. On the ambiguity side, one of the examples is actually one of the biggest policy debates in the United States right now. So as part of what was called the presidential nuclear initiatives, a huge, very, very smart, and I think positive for US security initiative under George H.W. Bush that he first started, he started pulling back US nuclear sea launched cruise missiles. So we have conventional sea launched cruise missiles. We actually fire them off on a pretty regular, we've used them against Syria. Cruise missiles have been used against Yemen, in Libya, sort of all sorts of different scenarios. So we have conventional versions of these weapons. There was a movement during the last administration to bring back US nuclear variants that George H.W. Bush and then his successors had all retired out of the US system. So in other words, if we're in a conflict with China, for example, and they know that the United States has both nuclear and conventional variants of basically the same weapon, and they get a reading or an indicator that something might be fired off of a system that could launch both, and there's a similar signature, you're relying on them to, if we indicate verbally, for example, that they are not under nuclear attack, you're relying on them believing us and not retaliating with a nuclear attack of their own, which is again.
And this has happened. This kind of close scare with like a false positive. This has happened several times, right, throughout history.
There have been false readings of satellite systems and things like that, for sure. But again, like you think of all of the humans and their decision-making calculations and how fast they have to make them. If a leader of that country has 10 minutes to decide whether they are retaliating against a nuclear weapon or if this was a conventional attack, that is very, very small decision space for them to come to the right decision. And so, again, one of the things that we would advocate for, and that, again, the Biden administration is trying to push in this direction, let's leave our sea launched cruise missiles conventional only. Let's not introduce a nuclear variant of a super similar system that could even create that scenario in the first place. That way, if we need to do nuclear signaling, or if, heaven forbid, there's an actual consideration of using a nuclear weapon, there are a whole set of ballistic missiles and systems that we already have in our arsenal. We don't need to add in this additional nuclear weapon that doesn't really give us very different capabilities from the existing arsenal, but it could lead down the road to this type of scenario where you have leaders on both sides who have to deal with that extra layer of ambiguity that we just don't, we don't believe it's required for deterrence. But on the flip side, it has such a higher risk profile in terms of introducing these new dynamics into these conflict scenarios. So we're on the solution side, we're focused on how do we think through those scenarios, and then what is our actual, how can you adjust our nuclear posture and plans and policies and doctrines and thinking about these weapons, not just for us, but hopefully for other countries too, in ways that we sort of unravel how you would even get into those scenarios in the first place, and reduce the odds that you're ever going to get to those points.
I'm going to give you what I think is like an all-time but statement and say all nuclear wars are bad. Very clearly, we should have no nuclear wars of any kind. But I think the ones that would worry me the most and would worry most people the most are kind of the great power nuclear conflicts. If the US and Russia start firing nukes at each other where they've both got enough nukes to irradiate the planet 500 times over, right? Or if it's the US and China, probably a similar dynamic. If it's the US and North Korea, obviously that's still really, really horribly bad for there to be a nuclear war, but it doesn't feel like it has that same kind of like globe ending quality to it, simply by virtue of North Korea not having the quantity of nuclear weapons and being so imbalanced with America. Is this also how you think about the issue? Or are you kind of focused on like all of it is bad, we've got to attract all of it? Because when I think about this, I think, how do we minimize conflict specifically between the US and Russia and the US and China? And then maybe also, I guess you would probably throw in there, how do we minimize conflict between India and Pakistan, which seems like the one other place where you could have like huge arsenals of missiles getting shot at each other?
I agree. Actually, we are most concerned about outright conflict and conflict escalating to a nuclear threshold with Russia and China. Russia, obviously, being, since they're close to our level of actual quantities of nuclear weapons and destructive power and things like that, that is, certainly the ultimate concern. I add North Korea into the list a little bit, not because I think that it would be a sort of world-ending scenario in terms of a nuclear conflict occurring, but because I'm so worried about conflict actually occurring. Given the status of things, the near total lack of communication, the fact that it seems like we've edged towards conflict multiple times with them. Again, you get a decision maker in the White House on our side, or in Seoul, or a concert of decision makers across different countries who, if they determine that they just are not going to tolerate, Kim's activities anymore, and that they feel like force is necessary, that's a very grim scenario. And again, on the flip side, what if he just determines that that is happening and he miscalculates the situation because we put more pressure on him or other things? If he were to decide that it was inevitable that we were going to attack him and that they needed to take the first action of entering into a conflict, those are the pathways that I'm more concerned about leading up to that, not because their destructive power of their nuclear arsenal is anywhere near what the United States is. But yeah, absolutely. And it's if we think through the scenarios that are the most likely to lead to absolute catastrophic level of nuclear weapons use, for example, between the United States and Russia, it does give you lots of ideas and tools for how countries might work together to reduce the risks of any nuclear weapons being used. So again, sort of mixing how do you get that sort of long-term ensuring that this is not going to end humanity, and matching it up to sort of near-term risk reduction steps is something that I think we're seeing more and more countries thinking in this direction like we are.
I want to go ahead and put my cards on the table and say, I think this is a good thing for people to be working on. And I'm glad that you guys are working on it, that you have funding to study this problem. I don't agree the risks are as high as you are. I would not put the number as probably as high as you do. But even if you think the risk of a nuclear war is like 5 or 10%, that's still a really high number. We should still be guarding against that, right? But one of the things that frustrates me, even as someone who thinks like this is really valuable work to do, is that it's hard for me to know whether or not things are really being accomplished or not, right? Like, for instance, we're doing this series on effective altruism. We've talked with Lewis Ballard, who is an animal rights activist, and they can point to kind of very tangible gains. And like we've gotten this factory farm model outlawed in this number of states, and this many chickens are now no longer being tortured in this specific way. And there's kind of very tangible wins. And if you come from the more classic EA approach of like, let's just send bed nets to people in Africa so they don't get malaria, again, there's kind of this very quantitative, very rigorous way of looking at things. You can prove the impact you're having. And it's not that I don't think that the work you do is valuable, but sometimes I wonder, like with nuclear risks, like it all feels like, well, we're trying to implement a strategy and we're making sure people have a framework for doing this. And I don't know, is that just kind of the nature of what you're doing? Do you accept that as kind of an accurate criticism, or do you think that there are kind of empirical ways to look at what you're doing, or is that just how it has to be when you're dealing with a problem that is of this nature?
I think we should constantly challenge ourselves to look for evidence of progress. And I think that's very healthy, and probably the field didn't do enough of it over the last 20 years. So there are a lot of huge gains in nuclear security and arms control and things like that for a very long time. But again, I think it's important not to take your eye off of trying to measure exactly that. And there are things that you can do. And part of it gets to having goals that you will actually see some sort of progress against in the near term in case it takes a long time. So for example, right now, one of the huge gaps is that we have almost no dialogue with China. Certainly not on a bilateral basis, though there is some group discussion in the P5 format with our other partners there. A metric, again, it's not thousands of numbers of bed nets or things like that, but for us, some of our metrics in this can we get started talking to China? How does that look? And we've mapped out sort of different pathways that we think that could look like, both from an NGO perspective to show whether we are making any progress or wasting our time and need to pivot and do something else. But then also, in terms of actually trying to influence the governments to get there. So we actually have done similar things like that to map out what are the sort of steps and signals to know if the investments of our time and energy and resources are actually paying off. And I want us to always, as an organization, be questioning if we give something a year, 2 years, 3 years, and we are just not seeing traction, we need to think hard about what we're doing with our time. And I think our funders should reasonably question whether the investment should go in another direction and that type of thing. And the big thing too is, like, you don't want to paint this picture that progress in nuclear affairs is not tractable, and that there's nothing people can do. That's the worst thing. But some of that gets back to prioritization. So, everybody in this field is incredibly well-intentioned, but there are some objectives that I just disagree with right now. So, like, there's a lot of push, for example, to get the U.S. Senate to ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Now, the U.S. Senate, under its current construct and people making up that body, they are just not going to pass a treaty, period. It's virtually impossible for that to happen. And it's a structural issue with the Senate. It gets to the people who are in the Senate and all of these sorts of things. And it would be absolutely fantastic for our country to do that. But should we as an organization spend our time and effort and money trying to accomplish something that has almost no chance of success? And my answer comes back to no. Unless, again, it is so overwhelmingly important that we think that it still requires that. And I would set a very high bar for activities being in that category. And so it looks different. It's not going to be a numbers game in the same type of way, but You can definitely look at the nuclear landscape today. You can definitely map out what's happening, what's not happening, what's getting better, what's getting worse, and then start to think of what are some specific steps that would show us that we are helping to create an arc away from the more dangerous scenarios. What are the things that could indicate to us that there are narrative shifts in how senior leaders think and the public perhaps think about these weapons? What are the things that can show that there's tangible progress in countries actually coming to some sort of common agreement in what steps would reduce the risks of nuclear weapons being used? That is all progress. It's all very, very important. We're also hoping to shape some of the actual nuclear weapons themselves in terms of not in a numerical sense necessarily, but for us, one of the big steps is how can we get countries to pivot away from these capabilities that we think are higher risk than other types of nuclear weapons in terms of actually having a future leader trigger their use or them being involved in some sort of miscalculation that ends up leading to actual nuclear conflict. And there are a lot of specific activities and ideas. And again, for us, we would hold those as metrics. And again, similarly, we should be asking ourselves all along the way whether this is making a difference and a big enough difference. And could we do more, or should we pivot and do things differently?
One of the questions I have listening to this whole conversation in my own head is, do you think that most of the risk comes from technical capabilities? Like, in the future, nukes are going to be in suitcases and backpacks, and like it's going to be nearly impossible to stop the spread, and that's why it's so risky? Or is it not a technical cause, but a kind of an organizational political cause that people aren't going to communicate enough between nations, or they're going to have the wrong internal framework for how to deal with this, and like that's the real risk? Or do you think it's mostly one or the other?
No, I think it's inherently a combination of both. And this is part of my frustration when I left the Pentagon, and which also contributed to the founding of the Council on Strategic Risks, is this was a problem set I really wanted to work on. There was a lot of focus on declaratory policy. And so what would we actually do in different scenarios? And what do we tell other countries we would do or wouldn't do? And that type of thing. And often that's considered low-hanging fruit in terms of creating change. Sometimes I don't think any change in the nuclear field is low-hanging fruit ever. And there's a lot of important stuff that can still happen on the declaratory side, but you've got to match it with the technology side as well. So we could have policies that indicate that we are going to have restraint and that we are reducing the role of nuclear weapons in our strategy and in our posture. But if US nuclear weapons investments are clearly going in another direction, if they are clearly going in a direction of more diverse capabilities and nuclear weapons that would be oriented toward a wider range of scenarios and different conflict employments and things like that, then it's pretty clear that they are changing, that the way that we are envisioning nuclear weapons as part of our deterrent and potentially warfighting capabilities is evolving in a way that's different from what our policies state. So
you're saying that basically the government is like, they're saying they want to slow things down, but then on the technical side, they're trying to invent new, scary, like awesome nuclear weapons that we don't yet have. And that's almost like contradictory.
Exactly. And other countries will see that and it will alarm them. And it's a very bad world if we all start behaving that way. So we need to be mindful of that. On the US perspective, I think the current administration has pivoted us back into a much more aligned direction on that. You see this manifesting a lot with questions about China right now. So they are increasing their number of nuclear weapons, but also toying with some different types of capabilities and things like that, though they still say that their nuclear posture and the purpose of their nuclear weapons is solely for deterrence and not for first strike capabilities. And all of these things that, people really kind of took them at their word for the most part, 10, 15 years ago. But with some of the changes that they're making to their system, experts and officials are pretty divided in terms of what it really means in terms of how they envision the roles of these weapons for them.
So I want to shift to talking about one of the other big areas that CSR covers, and that is biological weapons. So can you give us the basic story on why we should be worried about biological weapons? We've been talking about nuclear this whole time, but what is the basic case for this kind of really catastrophic risk coming from biological weapons?
Yeah, it's a good question. And again, going back in history, not even all that far, the Soviet Union had an industrial scale biological weapons program that could have killed everybody on Earth. So just one example, in just one of the factories that they had as part of this system, they had capability to weaponize enough anthrax. The number was something like 300 kilograms of weaponized anthrax within 8 months it could produce. So this has happened before. Countries have had very, very large scale biological weapons programs. Not a lot of countries. Other countries, like the United States, worked on relevant capabilities as part of their biodefense programs, but then halted all those, any offensive related capability development and research and things like that when we signed onto the Biological Weapons Convention and indicated that we were going to work with other countries to get rid of biological weapons. So it was a little bit before the convention started, but President Nixon had decided we were going to pivot away entirely from these weapons. But they've happened before. The current public assessment from the State Department assesses that Russia and North Korea both have biological weapons programs and activities, and concern that China and Iran are sort of toying with things that cross the line from defensive sort of protective capabilities to actually potentially being offensive biological weapons programs as well. So that's the public assessment of it. But again, if you look at the history of weapons of mass destruction, how countries have decided to possess them, to hide them at various times, whether and to what degree they actually engage with the international cooperative bodies and the treaties that ban these weapons now, which obviously on the nuclear side, for example, North Korea just flat out left the non-proliferation treaty. There's a lot of variance. And if you find historical examples where countries have used their science and technology bases to advance different types of weaponry, and how those scientific workers have been part of those programs and decision-making, as well as on the political side, how political leaders of different nations have been involved with those programs, or sometimes barely even known about some of those activities at their level until they've gone on for a while. There's a lot of room for concern. There's also on the threat side, one of the issues with biological weapons is obviously so hard to hide. There's legitimate, positive, amazing advances in biotechnology and pharmaceutical development and vaccine development, and just all these different things occur on the civilian side day to day everywhere around the world, and it's extremely positive. And the fact that a lot of those tools can be misused even by one or two actors on the nefarious side could, for one thing, be very, very easy to hide, which is a unique challenge in this particular domain. But again, on the threat side, you worry that one of our concerns is that if you have an actor who's actually clearly willing to breach international law and it does not respect the line, the line against using weapons of mass destruction or possessing them, that such actors might actually view biological weapons as more attractive for use than certain other types of weapons. So there are dangers in that. So if you have a disease that's infectious, you could release it and then it could end up affecting a lot of people who you didn't intend to target as one sort of unintended consequence. But there are pathogens that are not infectious diseases. There are pathogens that are not infectious diseases that could be used as well. Anthrax is relatively non-infectious and is an example of that. But you could use biological weapons in a way that's relatively covert, where a country might not even know that they've been the victim, unless you have really robust detection systems and an ability to characterize really quickly what has happened, because it could manifest looking just like a natural disease outbreak.
And of course, this gets back into, there are conspiracy theories about the origins of COVID-19. And I don't think that there's a whole lot of evidence that COVID would have been like made in a lab and used as a bioweapon. I don't think that's the correct case. But when it first came out, people at least considered the possibility that might be a case, and were worried about something like that in the future. And I guess this plays into the technology thing that you were saying, right? Where, and I'd actually love for you to correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I've read things and I don't know how to evaluate them because it's not my area of expertise. But I've been hearing things like, we're not far away from the future where somebody can buy $1,500 worth of equipment online and re-engineer like the smallpox, disease, like from scratch in their basement. And like you said, there's no way to trace that, like nuclear weapons, they come with a distinct signature. You can, if somebody's like enriching uranium, literally it gives off enough radiation, you can see it from space. And like, it's just very obvious in a certain way. This would not be. Is that kind of technical capability what you're worried about? Like the lone actor, or just the hard to trace nature of it?
My biggest concern is state level biological weapons programs. So I'm concerned about the lone actors, concerned about terrorists being attracted to these weapons and their increasing accessibility or capability that they could co-opt perhaps and things like that. But that, the really, really big fear is that there would be a nation state that has nation state level resources that they bring to that game. So somebody could do a lot of damage with something in their basement if they actually know how to tweak viruses and come up with a big batch of smallpox that would actually be really effective against humans and do it correctly. The people would have to have the knowledge and a little bit of access. And again, it is a big problem that's changing. But that is, it's definitely a concern. I'm definitely more concerned about a nation state that could do that on an industrial scale, and what they might have intentions of actually doing with what they create.
When I think about what the actual risk is, I kind of use two things as a model here. I'd love just to get your feedback, I guess, on how I think about this. I'm going to use one of the crazy buts again and say all biological weapons usage is bad and we should hope for none of it. But, when I think about like a truly catastrophic risk, I have to admit I'm a little bit skeptical that like biological weapons would truly be like the humanity ending kind of catastrophic. Because I think about like, well, okay, what if somebody's able to release a plague that is as bad as the worst one we've seen in the last several hundred years? It's as bad as the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu killed, 50 million people, but it didn't end civilization, and it didn't even stop economic growth for very long. And that's one way that I think about it. Even if it's twice as bad as COVID or as bad as the Spanish flu, it's bad, but it's not catastrophic in the sense of, total nuclear war would be catastrophic. The other way that I think about this is I kind of make an analogy to chemical weapons, where chemical weapons were used more heavily in the past, and they seem to have fizzled out a little bit. They're still used in bits and starts in a few places around the world, but they mostly just don't seem to be something that people think about as a big danger anymore. And I wonder if biological weapons shouldn't be thought of in the same way. How would you respond to some of those points? Because obviously you've spent more time on this problem than I have. So it may just be that I'm, I don't have the right frame of mind here, but I'm curious what your reaction is.
Yeah, I definitely think about the problem set differently. And again, we don't think of this in the terms of the challenge of, the theory is not that every nation in the world or half of nations or even a quarter of them are going to be attracted to these weapons of mass destruction and then seek to develop them and certainly not seek to use them. But again, even if there are a small handful who would consider these things and consider a wide range of uses for them, that is a very, very potentially catastrophic risk. And that's a very big problem. So on the chemical side, for example, the chemical weapons have been used pretty regularly. Considering that it is an outlawed weapon that the world had largely decided was completely taboo and unacceptable in terms of its risk to humanity, the fact that you're still seeing chemical weapons used in Syria and in these assassinations conducted by Russia, North Korea, and others is extremely alarming. And again, it was not too long ago, if you consider Iran-Iraq war and things like that, it wasn't actually that long ago that they were still being used in warfare somewhat as well, when the Iraqi attacks against the Kurds and others. So for us, one of our big concerns is that, again, most countries are complying and have fully sort of accepted this taboo against weapons of mass destruction, but there do still seem to be a couple that feel that it's acceptable, certainly on the chemical weapons side, and that indicates to us that they would probably not have a hardline taboo against biological weapons either. We're concerned a lot about some of the same actors in this regard, but then generally, what does that tell the world? Another risk in this is, do all the other countries that are complying, is there at some point that this gets out of hand to the point where other countries start to say, you know what, complying with international law is not meeting my security needs anymore. These treaties aren't working for me anymore either. And then you have more again, might not be dozens, but even if you have a world where there are a couple of additional cheaters that either have covert weapons programs or just fully pull out of the treaties and just stop participating in international cooperation to ban these deadly weapons, that's a bad world. And again, on the flip side too, again, let's plan for these worst case scenarios. If even just a couple of countries are of concern with regard to biological weapons and chemical weapons and potentially using them and these sorts of things, if you plan for what you do about that, it can also address some of the near-term needs. So, if you think about if we had an equivalent of the Soviet biological weapons program that we were guarding against right now, you think of what detection capabilities would you be deploying all around Ukraine, for example, or around NATO countries, given the conflict that's going on. How do you train people? How do you increase their protective gear in a reasonable way? What are all the things that you can do to reduce the potential effectiveness of biological weapons as much as possible? Those are all fantastic investments and fantastic things that can be done now that will also have benefits to public health and technology development on the defensive side that will hopefully over time convince countries that not only are these weapons illegal, but the use of them is not going to be effective at creating mass casualties anyway. So there's no taking the risk of extreme breach in international law and things like that is just not part of their calculation of what they would do anymore. The ultimate goal would be to affect that political calculation. But even if you do all of the things that we would want to be done, and that a lot of countries are doing on the defensive side against this type of catastrophic risk, there's huge upside for technological development that benefits public health, that benefits international cooperation, and all of those things that are positive.
Yeah, I think we agree on like some of the steps to be taken. More international cooperation is good. More pandemic preparedness and public health measures are good. I think we agree on that. I'm just kind of not seeing the real catastrophic nature of some of the things. Like, are we really talking about things that would be like on the magnitude of the Spanish flu, or like even worse in terms of like what could actually be released out there?
Far, far, far worse. Absolutely. And that's even diseases that we know about that could potentially be weaponized, that could be far, far more devastating than the Spanish flu, for example, or than COVID-19. And that already exists. And we are now decades into advances in genetic engineering and biotechnology advances that could, again, change that game even further with deliberate manipulation. And again, hopefully all of these tools will be used for good. But even if there's a single nation state, for example, or a couple of them that decide that having extreme bioengineered weapons is somehow to their benefit, that could absolutely be a catastrophic world-ending threat.
One of the common themes that I see here between nuclear and between biological weapons is kind of this idea that technological progress is not always for the good, that in some sense, technology could be used to hurt us. We might have created the tools that will dig our own graves, in a sense, whether that's crazy nuclear capabilities, suitcase nukes, nukes on missiles that can get across the globe in 30 seconds. Those are all threats. Or whether it's, the ability to engineer a virus in your basement and in an easily concealable way that can kill a huge amount of people. Do you think that there's a sense in which like we need to slow technology down in order to stop risks?
It's a good parallel to what you're seeing in the AI safety movement now, which I think is very healthy. I'm not sure slowing down is often feasible, in part because of the diffuse nature of actors that are involved. So if you think on the bios, nuclear is a little bit different because of how it's governed, but on the bio side, you're not going to really be able to do too much to stop thousands and thousands of actors all around the world that are on the good side of the house in terms of developing positive uses of these advances. So there's a feasibility aspect of it, but I think it's much more, as things go, you have to be constantly vigilant and thinking ahead about the potential risks and misuses and downside. And again, even if it seems like the odds of those misuses and those risks coming to fruition are small, you need to develop systems that are going to be preventive and gear against those as proactively as possible. So again, it's fantastic to see this in the AI community, such as it is. There's a lot of rapid growth in that area, some of it quite alarming. And it's wonderful that there's a whole movement of people out there trying to think how to do this safely.
All right, so I know we only have you for a few more minutes, so we're coming up on time, and I want to ask you the traditional final question that we ask everyone on this podcast, and that is, where can people go to learn more? If they're interested in what we've been discussing today, in the threat from catastrophic risks from nuclear and bioweapons, where can people go to learn more? This could be white papers to read, books to read, people on Twitter to follow who are really informative, blogs, just anything that you think would be good for people who want to learn more about the issue.
It's a fantastic and difficult question in these fields in particular. The Council on Strategic Risk.org. So a shout out to us, but we are also a small think tank. And so I think one of the cool things in this area is the National Security Archive at the George Washington University. And they have this, it's historical, but it's this fantastic repository of basically weapons of mass destruction history during the Cold War. And again, I think what's really important is to look back at some of the things that have happened historically in terms of understanding how threats may manifest in the future, but also how nation states just behave, especially when they might not understand what's really happening in the other country, which is, again, increasingly common across some of the countries that we're really worried about, including, I'm sure, how others perceive the United States in some ways. So the National Security Archive, I think, is fantastic. The Dead Hand is a great book to read on this too. I would say one of the challenges, we see this acutely on the bio side, and we're actually working on a public Google Doc or website or something to handle it, but there's a lot of bad information out there too. So there are legitimate differences of opinion, but on the bio side in particular, even more so than I think in the nuclear field, there's such an extreme level of classification about biological weapons threats. And that's created, you can pick out any books on Amazon and it's probably 50-50 about whether or not they're actually accurate to real life. And not just in terms of perceptions and opinions, but in terms of actual history and what has actually occurred around the world. So we're trying to think of if there are ways to increase transparency in such a hard field that has that kind of an issue, and constantly thinking about what more we can do as an organization and a public organization to point people toward resources that are good. So hopefully we'll have more help along the way via our website and social media and things like that in the future. And then, of course, the EA Forum is a fantastic place to see a lot of very diverse and different opinions about all of these issues and what people might think about doing with them with regard to their own time and careers or public policy passions or things like that.
Well, I think you're working towards something that we are all working towards in the long run, which is a safer and more prosperous society. Most of my work focuses on the prosperous part, but I'm glad that there's somebody out there focusing on the safe part. Again, I just want to thank you for coming on and being our guest. Everyone, Christine Parthemore.
Thank you so much.